Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, New Resources to Support the Climate Leadership Commitments. My name is Gabriela Bocio, and I am the Communications and Education Manager at Second Nature. Today, we will be hearing from Anne Waple, Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at Second Nature, and Brett Pasinella, Senior Manager of Innovative Services. At the end, we're going to have 20 minutes for questions and answers. Please remember, you can submit questions for the Q&A at any time using the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. This webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording and the slides will be shared with all of the registrants in the days following this presentation. And now I will leave you with Anne Waple.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Thanks for attending. Hopefully what we'll be able to do today is to give you a little bit more information on some of the resources that we've been working on over the last several months in support of the climate leadership commitments that hopefully you heard about last week on the webinar that Tim Carter led. If you haven't heard about those, there is a video available of that webinar as well, and so I encourage you to check that out. I will repeat just a little bit of what was in that webinar up front, just to give you a bit of orientation. But as I say, it would be useful if you wanted to know a bit more to go to that video from last week. So I'm going to dive right in, and go through some of these slides. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions as well, we hope. So we encourage you to submit those as we go through. So first slide, really want to thank a number of the people that we work with from the private sector. It's really pretty crucial for us to be able to work across different sectors as higher education connects a lot of what we do from the public and the private and community efforts. Our corporate partners are pretty important in helping us do all of that from an intellectual perspective, as well as obviously helping to support us through some sponsorship as well. So we're very grateful to all of them, and we've been doing some good projects with them this year. So moving on to the content here. So as you're aware, we hope, we've recently, a couple of weeks ago, released these new climate leadership commitments. Many of you, probably most of you on this call, are already familiar with the carbon commitment. It is the outgrowth of the ACU-PCC, the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. So that has transitioned into the carbon commitment. But over the last year or so, we've been working pretty hard on figuring out how to also blend into what we do adaptation and resilience. And so we have a standalone commitment on resilience, but what we really hope that people will do is to pull these two elements of climate leadership together, resilience and carbon, into this integrated climate commitment. And all of those of you who are already carbon commitment signatories, if you want to add resilience to that, you'll be signing up for the climate commitment. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute, but these are the commitments that we're talking about when we're discussing the resources to support them. So next slide. So this is a couple of slides that Tim showed last week. Just to quickly reiterate, a lot has changed in the last decade. Since the ACU-PCC was launched in 2006, we've seen really large changes externally in the way in which we can engage in sustainability and the circumstances in which we are doing sustainability work. And this is just one illustration. In 2005, very little work was going on solar, and in 2015, of course, it's a completely different environment where solar actually looks like it can make up a significant part of a renewables portfolio. So completely different circumstances on the renewables and energy management side. And at the same time, across our network, we've seen over the last decade very few colleges having dedicated sustainability staff. A decade ago, whereas almost all colleges have some level of sustainability engagement at this time, and many have a dedicated position. So that gives us greater capacity. It also, of course, we have more work to do across all of those. But I think we're definitely seeing different circumstances in which we need to engage into the climate and sustainability question. Next slide, please. So we've been thinking about how do we evolve the climate leadership commitments, and how do we make sure that we're supporting the network in appropriate ways given all of these changes. And we haven't actually seen many updates across our network and the climate commitments in the 9 years since the ACU-PCC was introduced. So we're certainly now seeing the need to adapt to existing climate changes, as well as really continue to invigorate the work around carbon neutrality and carbon reduction overall. Certainly over the course of the last few years, as we've been looking at this, it has emerged that carbon neutrality is still very much a useful concept. It's transformative for many campuses and really engages people with bold goals and innovative ways in which campuses are going about doing this. And we're also seeing this need to include adaptation and resilience. So that's part of the goal of this is to update and make sure we've got the right components of the carbon commitment, as well as adding this resilience component. So just as you can see underneath, we want to streamline and make sure that we're learning from all of the work that's happened over the last decade, streamline the commitments, and make sure that we're connecting higher education across in different communities, different sectors, so that we can have the kind of transformative impact that we really want to and are capable of having as a network. So as I mentioned, these are the 3 commitments that have come out of this work. The climate commitment is the integration of the carbon commitment and the resilience commitment. So if you're already a carbon signatory and you want to add resilience, you would transition to the climate commitment. But it is still possible to sign either the resilience commitment as a standalone commitment. If you just want to start there, look at resilience, that's possible. And certainly the leadership associated with the carbon commitment is just still very much something that we're supportive of, and you can do that individually too. What we're trying to do here is to show you the resources in association with all of this, and particularly introduce resilience for you a little bit more, since that's one of the newer components here. So this also has a little bit of impact in how we think about our network, and again, Tim mentioned this last week, and you can hear his comments on the video, but essentially it was a bit confusing where we previously had the ACU-PCC, which was the commitment that people signed, but we also tended to refer to the network of signatories as the ACU-PCC, and so it was a little bit confusing as to how we did that. After this launch a couple of weeks ago, not only do we have a groovy new logo for Second Nature, but we've tried to clarify a little bit how the commitments in the network interact with each other. So we have these climate leadership commitments, the 3 of them together constitute the climate leadership commitments, and this is supported by, or at least you are a climate leadership network signatory if you commit to one of these 3 commitments. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer too when you can refer to all of these different components.
So
okay,
I would,
yes, go ahead, Brett. So Brett's going to introduce some of the commitments in particular, and then I'm going to say a little bit more about resilience a little bit later.
Right. Thanks, Anne. So I just want to briefly go into a little bit of the content of the commitments, just so you'll have kind of a grounding of what we're talking about as we talk about the resources to support these commitments. And as we've said, Tim Carter went into these slides about the details of the commitments in a little bit more detail last week. So if you're interested in learning more about what composes each of the commitments in a little bit of greater depth, take a look at Tim's video, which is online now. So as we've said, one of the first commitment I'd like to go over is the carbon commitment, and this is the continuation of the ACU-PCC. So if you are already an ACU-PCC signatory, you have now become a member of the carbon commitment. You are a signatory to the carbon commitment. If you would, as an ACU-PCC signatory, if you would like like to become part of the climate commitment, that would require an additional signing on your part to bring in the resilience component to all of the work you've already been doing under ACU-PCC. But if you would just like to continue with the work that you're doing around carbon mitigation, then no action is required of you to become a signatory to the carbon commitment. You're just automatically a signatory based on your signing of the ACU-PCC. So the goal of the commitment is to really just take the lessons that we've learned over the last decade around carbon mitigation and all of the great work of all of our signatories, and apply that to our new tools, our new resources, and the new structure of the commitment. Basically, the two major things that have changed regarding the carbon commitment from the ACU-PCC is the first is that the tangible actions, which were initially direct part of the ACU-PCC, are now, we're sort of treating them as resources. They're ideas for you to get your campus going if you're just starting out around climate action, but they didn't seem appropriate in the commitment themselves because they change over time. Some of the things that were recommended in 2005 are no longer really relevant to many campuses, or many campuses have already done most of those things by the time they sign the commitment. So we've taken them out. It gives people a little bit more flexibility when they're determining what actions to include in their climate action plans and things like that. And it also gives Second Nature more flexibility in terms of where we'll be more active with updating potential tangible actions or quick start actions to help support people who are working on the commitment or just getting started on it. And in terms of reporting, a major change coming in 2017 is that greenhouse gas inventories will be annual instead of every other year. Reason for that was 70% of our signatories who are currently active in reporting already report their greenhouse gases on an annual basis. And we've found from sort of working with our signatories over the last 10 years is that a lot of people struggle with the intermittent nature of doing the inventory, having to sort of reconstitute that team after a year of inactivity, ramp up the process again. It just helps with the institutionalization of the whole process and its integration into the decision making to just continue to track those emissions on an annual basis. Seems like a better solution for campuses. So we've included that now as part of the commitment, and it will be part of the annual reporting. In terms of the resilience commitment, the broad goal is stated here. It's the ability to survive disruption and to not only just survive, but to anticipate, adapt, and flourish. So resilience is really more than just reducing vulnerability to negative impacts. It's really thinking about future scenarios in which your community can flourish and adapt in the face of a changing climate, changing energy needs, changing infrastructure needs, and changing human needs and things like that. And we'll go a lot more into the planning structures that support the resilience commitment in the next part of the webinar. But just to show you some of the goals, it's really focused on having an inclusive process to integrating the community, taking the expertise and the research and the innovation that is coming out of the higher education sector and building strong links to that with the larger community outside of higher education. And some of the key concepts that we're looking for is to just increase those community partnerships, be able to think of ways to assess these different aspects of resilience through different indicators, and overall increasing the adaptive capacity of communities that are signatories to this commitment. And so the next phase of that is then, well, okay, so with carbon neutrality, we have a very easy indicator for your commitments around carbon. How close are you to carbon neutrality? What are your greenhouse gas emissions? With resilience, it's a little bit more difficult to try to translate the concept of adaptive capacity into measurable indicators that allow you to understand how you're progressing towards goals. So campuses would determine their own indicators in each of the different areas of resilience, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But that is a core part of the resilience commitment, is to develop indicators around resilience and then be able to track your individual campus and community's progress towards them. And the ultimate goal is to have a systems level assessment and indicators that help you perform that assessment. And so you can really build that up over time, starting however you want it. Maybe you want to start around a theme, or maybe you want to start around sort of a vulnerability assessment. Well, what are our gaps? What are our needs? What are we lacking? And that's the assessments and indicators that you might start with. So it's a very flexible approach that people can tailor to their individual community and their campus. And obviously indicators will vary from region to region. Indicators that are very important in one region may be less important in a different region, and people just may have different priorities for their campus and things like that. So the commitment allows flexibility around how you measure how resilient your campus actually is. And like we said, the climate commitment is literally those two commitments put together. And the goal is to just be holistic, have a complete approach of integrated planning to climate action, that both looks at mitigation and adaptation resilience at the same time, and allows for a fully integrated reporting structure, the same internal structures on your campus and your community. You may have subgroups that maybe focus on one area or the other more specifically, but all in all, the planning structures and the infrastructure and support systems that you have on campus can be working in both of these areas simultaneously and have the same format in terms of reporting and sharing data with the rest of the network. So from there, we'd like to jump into taking a look at the guidance that we've developed to help support these new commitments. The website is listed there at the top of the page. It's very easy to find from just our homepage as well, taking you to the guidance page. And we basically have 4 components to the guidance. The first is we have the text of the actual commitments themselves. So if you want to read through them in more detail and understand each of the requirements and look at the differences between the different commitments, that is all listed here on the guidance page. We also have a short, much more targeted guidance called the Commitments Implementation Guidance, and this follows the text of the commitments much more closely. It sort of walks you through, okay, so there's this requirement in the commitment. Here are some of the things that you would need to do to be able to fulfill that particular requirement. And then from the Commitments Implementation Guide, it links out to the Sustainability Planning and Climate Action Guide for places where you can go to find much more detailed information and guidance about those particular aspects of the climate commitments. This is also our main planning guide. It's much more in-depth and much more holistic than sort of following the step-by-step, how do we meet the requirements of the commitments. This is more sort of a guide for understanding how you would go about sustainability planning on your campus. It sort of incorporates all of the learning that we've had over the last decade from all of our different campuses in signatories, and puts it into a more detailed framework that really helps you go back and think about how do we organize, how do we adapt, and how do we best implement the spirit of the commitments, as well as just the sort of individual requirements that are listed out in the text of the commitment. And now this is taking a look at sort of the table of contents of that Sustainability Planning and Climate Action Guide. And one of the differences in this guidance from our previous guidance is, in our previous guidance we're sort of focused on very specific topics. How do you create a climate action plan? How do you do a greenhouse gas inventory? But we didn't spend a lot of time talking about a lot of the fundamentals, the foundations of organizing sustainability work on a campus. And by working with our signatories, we've really seen drastic differences in campuses' abilities to implement the commitment based on sort of how they organize themselves internally. So that's what we've tried to do here, is to really capture some of this knowledge and learning about what are some of the best practices for creating you know, a sustainability committee. What kinds of skills and background should a sustainability planner have? What are some of the best ways to quickly assess where your campus is in terms of sustainability? And how can you, with all of the different aspects of sustainability and all of the different possible actions that are available, how do you start creating a process for implementing some sustainability action on your campus? So that is really what this first section is all about, is the foundations of action. And these are things that would be valuable to sort of any campus, no matter where you are in your implementation of the ACU PCC or the new commitments. It's always good to kind of go back and reassess. Are we, do we have the right structures for implementing this going forward? Do we have the kinds of assessment tools that we need? Are we measuring our progress in an effective way? So this is really broadly useful to anyone, and it's also broadly useful between both people who are carbon signatories as well as resilience signatories. This is sort of like the common foundation that a campus would need to undertake climate action. And then the second section of the guide are really what we're calling, these building blocks. So these are much more of the specific topics where you can kind of pick and choose what you're working on at any given time, what you're interested in, what you want to dive into in a more detailed manner. So, if you're working on the carbon commitment, the carbon management chapter would be very useful to you, talking about how do you develop a mitigation plan, how do you track your greenhouse gas emissions in more detail. The same thing with climate resilience. This would be really targeted to people who are maybe already have a plan in place in terms of carbon, but are starting to think about how do we add resilience. And same with academics, financing, and data. Each of these pieces has particular tools to help you tackle each of those individual aspects of sustainability on your campus. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne to talk a little bit about the tools and the planning framework that goes into integrating resilience into the climate commitments.
Thanks, Brett. And I hope that gives you sort of an overview of some of the guidance. What we will do at the end is actually go to the live website as well, so we'll explore sort of with you a little bit of some of the content of these chapters too, so you can get more involved in that. So I'm going to say, because resilience is really some of the newest information that we have in our planning and commitments framework, we're going to spend just a little bit more time on that, and we know many of you have questions about that. So I'm not going to go very much into the reason why resilience is a part of what we're considering. I think almost everyone in the network understands that we are beginning to face climate impacts on campus. Next slide, please. But I did want to just say a couple of things about how when we add resilience, it not only helps us look at the specific elements of adaptation and resilience, but it also always keeps reinforcing the need for carbon reduction. And it's a very nice tie-in. It's why we've got this combined climate impacts, combined climate commitment, is because one really does reinforce the other. These are 4 emission scenarios for this century. At the top left is if we were to globally reduce carbon emissions significantly over the next couple of decades by mid-century, and then even further reduce emissions thereafter, we would still be probably looking at something like a 3 or a 4 degree Fahrenheit increase for the United States. So it really emphasizes that we must keep reducing carbon aggressively if we're to keep our temperature increases to something that seems sort of manageable. Anything beyond that is any one of these other scenarios, and of course the bottom right, 8 or 9 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit increase by the end of the century can become catastrophic. So just to make the point that these two things work together. A couple of other things just to note on the climate side. There are things that are universal about the ways in which people will have to adapt and things that are very different regionally. This happens to be the amount of precipitation that is falling in heavy events. It's the increase that we've seen, actually. This is not a projected increase. This is the amount of rainfall over the last several decades that has increased in heavy events. So, for example, virtually everybody in the US is going to have to deal with heavier rainfall events and associated flooding and stormwater management. But there's a significant differentiation between how much of a problem this might be in different regions. Obviously, the Northeast is not looking very good in this respect. So you get 70% more rainfall in the heavy events. And we've seen a number of instances where this has become a problem, including with Hurricane Irene and things like that. But it's not just the specific climate impacts that resilience allows us to explore. Because resilience really brings in the social and human elements in a way that some other frameworks don't do as well, we can start to look at some of those other impacts. So, for example, this is an investigation of how Katrina impacted the distribution of people following the event. So Katrina was in 2005. This is from 2006. And this shows that displaced people from New Orleans ended up in every single state in the United States. So not only does it have an impact on the community from which they left, New Orleans, but it also has widespread impacts on the communities in which people ended up. And so these are the kinds of things that we can look at when we talk about social and human elements of resilience, which I'll get into in just a second. There are other things I think that you can look at in terms of your overall adaptive capacity. This is around the New York City area, the expected change in the number of hospitalizations of children from asthma attacks. And this is a projection for the 2020s, so not too far out in the future, just a decade or so from now. Yeah, actually less than a decade from now. So you can see a 5 to 10% increase is expected in the number of kids in the ER as a result of asthma attacks. And this is as a result of a combination of changes in temperature combined with an increase in low-level ozone and ecosystem changes in the area that impacts the distribution of that ozone, for example. So when you're looking at resilience, we can start to look at, well, what are the circumstances, particularly when you have these combined events, a heat wave, air pollution, changing ecosystem. What's the capacity we need to develop as a community in order to stop these kinds of trends from getting too far out in front of us? And this implies, for example, that we would need to look at our ecosystem as a whole, our health resources as a whole, our wellness as a community, as well as the changes in climate. So this is where we're starting to go with resilience. I'm not going to spend very much on this one, but this is just to say, in the green here is the population of the United States. It's a little, right around 300 million people, and our change in our use of fresh water in the US. The blue is looking at the amount of fresh water we take out of the system relative to the x-axis on the left. And you can see for the sort of 4 or 5 decades, or 3 or 4 decades, in the middle part of the century, as population increased, we were taking a lot more fresh water out of the system. But in the middle, right here, in about 1980s, even as population was increasing, we were not taking any more water out of the system. We actually decreased our consumptive use of water. And that is almost entirely due to more efficiency, both in agriculture, which has a really big impact, as well as indoor plumbing, residentially, and so on, and we ended up being a much more efficient users of water starting at that point. So this is really just to illustrate that even as the climate changes, there are other ways in which we can change the relationship to our natural resources so that we're in a better position to withstand those changes. And I can talk about a little bit more about what changes you might expect if you would like, but this is really just sort of the underlying relationship that we can change. Okay, so just getting into a little bit more specifics then about our resilience planning framework. I'm going to do this relatively rapidly so we have lots of time for questions. These are the elements. Starts with a resilience assessment We're looking at future scenarios thereafter, what kinds of impacts we might experience on campus and in the community, and how that gets folded into decision options and a plan. But the very first part in the commitment is about developing a community campus collaborative structure. So a little bit more about that on the next slide. There are any number of ways in which you already have or can develop a relationship with the community from your campus. Most campuses certainly already have some interaction with the community, and it can be through faculty, through student groups, through administrative relationships with the, say, the mayor or the leadership of the community. But the point here is to develop something that is ongoing and regular in terms of interaction, so that you can have more understanding of how you are both looking to increase your resilience. You don't want to be in conflict with each other, obviously, as you put plans in place. But even more than that, you can actually be complementary and help each other develop a more resilient community. We've got some examples of what those structures could look like in the online guidance. But even as you look at the examples, don't be limited to those. It's really about building on existing interactions that you have and developing a more sustained way of sharing knowledge and plans, and even co-implementing some of those solutions that you come up with. So and there's a year to do that piece, and we feel like it's really important to be able to develop those relationships. That's a fundamental driver of success in many cases. Once you have that interaction, by the end of year 2 is where we would like you to develop an initial assessment of resilience. And this is really about assessing your capacity. We're going to talk a little bit about assessing risk in a minute. But starting with capacity allows you to see where your strengths are in the existing community and where some of your values are as a community. And when I say community, by the way, it could just be the campus, or it can be in conjunction with your surrounding city or community or neighborhood. It's ideal if it can be inclusive of the community, because, as I mentioned, resilience is hard to do just as an isolated campus. So really looking at where your campus fits into the broader community is important. So we've put together these 5 categories that you can use to assess your resilience. This is actually from some work done in Australia on how to measure adaptive capacity. So we didn't make this up, but this is a great framework. And we'll talk in just a second about the indicators. But if you can assess your capacity in these 5 areas, then that gives you a really good holistic framework for looking at your campus. So, and just this quote here down at the bottom, the idea about assessing capacity is so that it's not just about reducing the shocks that you might experience, but it is really about investing in your overall capacity to flourish in the face of change. You know, we don't have a choice at the moment in terms of that we are operating in a time of change, and so we really need to be able to invest in our capacity to handle that, no matter what that change becomes. So just as you can think about your own investment in your health and wellness, you don't just want to be disease-free, you want to be investing in your overall strength and ability to handle any number of challenges to your health. And the same is true for resilience. It's not just the absence of catastrophe, it is this overall investment. So looking at the next slide, what we mean by coming up with indicators of assessment of resilience can be illustrated by this wheel. We have a lot more examples on the online guidance, by the way. So those 5 categories at the center of the wheel, and around the edge of that center can be your indicators, and these can bring together a number of different variables that are important to your community. So for example, let's take the human category on the right there. Health and wellness falls into that human category. So you might have an indicator that is about improving the health and wellness of your community. And there's a number of different variables you can pull together to make up that indicator. So for example, it might be how close are you to outdoor recreational space in terms of walkability. So you want to encourage the walkability of your community, and you want to be able to get to places that allows for outdoor recreation. You might also say, let's say a 10% reduction in obesity might be a goal of yours on campus, for example. Those are things that allow you better capacity to deal with lots of impacts, lots of different impacts as you go forward, particularly heat waves, by the way. But there's a number of different things that you can come up with in that category. For example, Clark University has worked in combination with the City of Worcester to come up with a Community Health Improvement Plan, CHIP, CHIP. And there's a number of indicators in that, and we point to that example in the guidance, that are useful in the health and wellness category. But there's a number of different categories in each of these, or a number of different indicators rather, in each of these categories that you might consider. This is just an example. The point here is to develop in an inclusive way the things that mean the most to your community in terms of resilience, building on the unique characteristics and strengths of your particular circumstances. So when you've done an initial look at your resilience capacity, you then want to look at, well, where is it that we want to go in the future? Where do we want to be as a campus and as part of a vibrant community? And this is important because then this goes beyond that idea of responding to negative impacts. And the way that you can look at the future, sort of 10, 20, 30 years from now, there's an infinite variety of different ways you can go about it. Within this scenario planning idea, it should be very flexible based on how many resources and what kind of goals you have. So it can be a very limited exercise where it's sort of a, maybe a half-day workshop looking at different places that you might want to go, all the way through to multi-workshop, multi-community, inclusive processes, and so on. And as inclusive as you can be improves this process, because you get different ideas of what the values and priorities are of the community. So again, we give some different examples of this. This will be one of the areas that we also build out quite a lot over the next several months to a year. Based on a number of resources coming out right now from the federal government, we're actually involved in helping to produce those resources. So you can also watch this space for a little bit more on scenario planning. This is really going to help you, though, figure out where you want to be, where your desired thresholds of resilience will be in the future. So you've got an idea of your existing capacity. You've got an idea about where you want to go. The next step then is to look at, well, what are the risks in getting there, particularly from climate? So you can review your initial indicators and then compare this to what is the vulnerability and future impacts that you expect to experience. This graphic on the right is just an example of where in Lake Lanier, which is the main lake providing water for Atlanta, historical low levels of that lake have been problematic for Atlanta, but virtually all projections indicate that the levels will be lower in the future. And so there is a number of ways in which to prepare for that, but you have to sort of know what's coming in order to do that. And even with respect to nuclear power generation, this has been a problem for Atlanta, so not just water itself. Lots of resources exist for what you are likely to experience in your region. The U.S. National Climate Assessment is a really key resource, and we have a good relationship with the folks who are working on the National Climate Assessment. There's a large report and website resource that came out last year. But a lot of the contributors to that National Climate Assessment and lots of climate information come from your own faculty. They come from higher education. So don't forget to use the experts on your campus to look at the kinds of things that you're likely to experience. But this is now really about, so looking at your risk, you can add to your initial indicators and understand more about your future impacts and vulnerability. Ultimately, all of this together, your capacity, where you want to go, what risks you face, should then be folded into your plan. So this is year 3. So you have 3 years to go through this whole process. All of this will be folded into your plan. It will give you an idea of what are the real priorities in terms of developing your resilience. It allows you at this point then to set thresholds for what you want to achieve and dates by which you want to achieve those things. So let's say, for example, the 10% reduction in obesity is one of your indicators. You can set some targets for when that has to happen, some plans for how that has to happen, and some interim goals for you to know that you are making progress along that pathway. And this is part and parcel also, of course, within the commitment of folding this into the research and teaching around resilience. It's a pretty new area, and there's lots of interesting things coming out of the literature and the research. That's part of our leadership commitment here is folding this into the research and teaching. So that should be an exciting area of commitment as well. And then finally, just as with all of these commitments, it's appropriate to review them at least every 5 years so that if there are any changes, you can incorporate them. If there aren't any changes, that's fine. But we do ask that you review and resubmit the plan every 5 years. So that's about all I'm going to go into with the resilience planning. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of how the steps proceed. It is designed to be flexible, so each one of these components can be done as comprehensively or in an initial way to get you thinking about this as you go forward. But obviously the more comprehensive and inclusive you can be, the more this is likely to positively impact your planning. So I'm going to turn it back over to Brett for a little wrap-up, and then we'll show you the website while we answer questions.
Great. So what resources is Second Nature working on now? What are we doing? So over the course of the next year, we're really going to be convening some of these technical working groups from within the signatory network, the Climate Leadership Network, to help us build out some of these new tools and refine the guidance around the commitments and how to actually work through implementing these. And these are primarily focused on areas that are either new, like resilience. And this group can be thinking about what are some example indicators, what resources are out there for, scenario planning, what kinds of tools does the network need from Second Nature around scenario planning and vulnerability assessment. So looking at new areas or looking at areas that are drastically different in a drastically different space than they were in 2005 when the ACU-PCC was first launched. So this, an example of that would be the offsets group. Our offset guidance has not been updated since 2008, and at that time the offset space was a very new, very sort of Wild West area, and the guidance was kind of focused on how to make sure that you're getting a verified offset. How do you know that the offsets you're purchasing are actually valid? But there's so much more going on now on campuses in terms of institutions being much more sophisticated about where they're buying their power from, working with developers and utilities around power purchase agreements, buying and selling both RECs and offsets in different capacity markets and voluntary offset markets, and also a lot of campuses that are really looking at sort of the local offset space, the institution generated offsets. How can they do something within their local community to help reduce carbon? And that has a lot of overlap with resilience, and so we'd really like to take a look at some of those things. And as well as forest protocols, a lot of people have been making some initial assessments about what's carbon sequestration look like in their campus woodlands, but we haven't had a lot of protocols that develop a way of really taking that estimated sequestration and formalizing it in terms of an offset that could be marketed or used to reduce campus emissions, because there's a lot of technical challenges around that. So looking more deeply at some of those questions, as well as getting the reporting system ready for 2017 in these new reports. So we'll have a group that's sort of looking at What kinds of data fields do we need in the reporting system? How should the reports be structured? How can we better collect data and share data? And how can the data that you upload be more useful to you in terms of helping your decision-making processes on your campuses, as well as building out the academic aspects of the commitments. That's always been an integral part of the commitments going back to the founding of the ACU-PCC, but we've never developed a lot of resources around that particular topic. So we'd like to have a group looking at that. What are some of the best ways that we can help spur innovation, research, and learning around sustainability and climate? So with that, let's just spend a very quick moment diving into the website while Gabriella gathers up some of the questions that you would like us to address. So,
and I should say as well, I think before we jump into the website, what we didn't put on the slides is that if you're already a carbon signatory and you're looking to include resilience in your planning, so you're looking to move to the climate commitment, this integrated commitment, we do have a charter signatory period where if you want to move forward into this area, if you do that by January 2nd, you'll be part of this charter signatory group, which will be really sort of recognized for leadership, and hopefully that's a useful incentive as you're talking with your administration and your leadership. If they want to be part of this charter cohort, they can certainly do that, and we'd have to know about that by January 2nd. So if you have any more questions on that, also let us know about that, but important opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So here's the main Second Nature website. Here, Become a Climate Leader is where you can sign up for one of the commitments if you're not already a signatory. But all of the guidance that we talked about is located here under Climate Guidance. And this takes you into the page that we showed before with the 4 different resources we have for implementing the commitments. And here is the Sustainability Planning and Climate Action Guide that really has a lot of the in-depth discussion and planning and support for helping campuses implement this. So should we pause here for a moment to answer any initial questions? Gabriella, do you have anything for us?
Yeah, we have a few questions from the audience here that I can share with you. Before I share some questions, I would just like to take a moment based on some of the questions we received to clarify the relationship between the commitments once more, if that's all right with you. So one question that we got was about whether successfully implementing the resilience commitment would then make you be able to sign the climate commitment. But that is not quite the process. So if you would like to speak to that as a clarification before we jump into the other questions, I think that would be very useful for everybody on the call.
Sure. Yeah, we can totally. So I'm assuming that many of you on the call right now are already part of the Carbon Commitment Network. So let's just take that scenario first. If you've been an ACU-PCC signatory, you have automatically transitioned into the Carbon Commitment. If you want to add resilience to your planning, you simply sign the Climate Commitment. That Climate Commitment integrates both the elements of the carbon work that you've been doing, and it allows you to incorporate resilience. So you wouldn't sign, if you were already an existing ACU-PCC signatory, carbon commitment, you wouldn't then sign a whole separate thing on resilience. You would just move straight to this integrated commitment. So there's no prerequisite in terms of having already done resilience work. You're really just committing to do that work around resilience. If, on the other hand, you're coming in as a brand new signatory or your brand new interest in any of these, so you're not a previous ACU-PCC member, then you could choose whether or not to either look at the integrated approach of both carbon and resilience, in which case you'd look at the climate commitment, or you could sign either the carbon or the resilience. So there are no circumstances in which you would sign both the carbon or the resilience. You're either signing one or the other, or if you want to combine them, that goes into the climate commitment. Hopefully that clarifies a little bit. Happy for Brett or Gabriella to add anything to that.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think that was very clear, and I would like to highlight part of what you said. There are no prerequisites for becoming, if you were a new institution that was not an ACPCC signatory, is not a current signatory of any of these commitments, you do not need to have already projects in place for resilience or for carbon mitigation to decide that you want to start working on any of these.
That's right, and in fact, it's really, this is the leadership commitment. And all of these resources that we're talking about today should help you implement that commitment. And so we're really looking for people who are trying to do something new and are excited about that possibility. So very much here to help, even if you don't quite know where to get started or how to go about it. That's just fine. We're going to help you do that.
And that actually kind of leads me to the next question. One of the questions that we got was, if you're looking to start on resilience, where do you begin?
Right. Well, I think a lot of people already do have some elements of climate adaptation and resilience as part of what they're doing. I think it probably, because we've got this planning framework in place, it probably sounds a little bit more intimidating than it might. But I think a lot of people already have some significant work that's happening to support resilience. Lots of campuses, for example, have social justice or sustainability with a social focus, for example, and that can feed right into your adaptive capacity from the social and human perspective in terms of resilience. So really one of the first places to begin is not only establishing your relationship with your community. Again, many of the campuses will already have somewhere to begin with that. And we've given a full year for that to really develop and take place. But also looking at where you already are working on elements of resilience. And I think you might find that in some surprising places. So this first year or two of looking at capacity is really designed to give you some flexibility to look at what you've got, look at what you value as a campus in connection with the community, and to think about how to build that into what you want to improve over time. So really where to begin is looking across your campus. Where do you already have intersections with the community, and where do you already have work going on that you can build on?
And I feel like that, what you were just saying about looking for places where you can build upon and looking for where there's work already happening on some of this, might help to answer another one of the questions we received, which was, do you have any advice for small offices meaning, one employee who is in charge of doing initiatives such as these?
Mm-hmm. I can answer that one. Yeah, we thought about that a lot in terms of creating this new guidance. And this chapter, Organizing for Action, might be some place to really look and read through in detail and think about some of the suggestions in there. Really, the strength of a one-person office is the role that that person plays on their campus as sort of a facilitator, a bringing together of resources that are on the campus. And so you should really think about approaching the planning process not as, I'm the person who's going to go out and implement all of this stuff on my campus, but rather from, I'm the person on my campus who's going to bring together everyone else on the campus around this topic and sort of lead the planning team, but ultimately the implementation and all of the actions that will happen as a result of that planning process will be things that are drawing upon the resources of your institution in other areas. So, thinking more about the facilitator role than sort of the implementer role, as a one person, and really looking for ways to utilize all of the strengths that your organization already has around sustainability and all of the activities that other offices and other departments and things on your campus are already doing, and just looking for ways that you can bring them together around sustainability. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and that's a particularly useful thing for resilience, because part of the process of building resilience is about building a stronger community, and that's as important on campus as it is in the broader community. And so that's actually not just something that's useful to do in order to achieve better outcomes, but an outcome in itself is bringing people together in more cohesive ways around resilience.
And something that's kind of in a similar vein, thank you for that, is someone is looking for advice for how to integrate resilience commitments or resilience planning into existing climate action planning. Is there a particular part of the guide that you would direct someone who's looking for that kind of information to?
You want to go ahead, Brett?
Yeah, I'll start. I would say probably, taking a look at these first three foundational chapters, probably particularly assessment and prioritizing action. Where a lot of our signatories are now is that they have had a climate action plan that is maybe 5 years old or even older for some of the people who signed really early on in the history of the ACU-PCC. And they've now gotten to a point where they're sort of maybe getting close to a target, or excuse me, thinking about, are we really going to make our targets, or where can we go? We've done 5 or 10 years worth of work in implementing climate mitigation. What do we do next? And we need to really go back and look at our climate action plan to figure out where we are now and where we need to go next. And that is a great opportunity for integrating resilience there. To reconstitute your climate action planning team and check in on all of your mitigation goals, but then also say, hey, maybe as part of this process, let's add some of the resilience indicators to this process as well. So we have, carbon neutrality, and we have all of our metrics and indicators of how well we're doing on carbon neutrality, but we should also be thinking about, the health of our community, or our water, or financial stability, or all of these other 5 components of potential indicators for resilience. And that is actually a new requirement of the commitments as well, is a sort of periodic review and update of your climate action plan. Under ACU-PCC, it was sort of one and done. You created a climate action plan and that was it. Now it's sort of every 5 years or so, going back and looking at that climate action plan and saying, like, yes, this is still a valid plan. We're still going to meet these goals, or we need to change these goals. We're closer than we thought. Through the price of renewable energy came down, allowing us to purchase more of it than we were able to financially in the past. Or gee, we've really been struggling, and we're going to have to take an extra 5 years or something to try to reach carbon neutrality. So that provides a really great opportunity for starting to integrate resilience. And these 2 chapters, first 2 chapters, organizing for action and assessment and prioritizing action, really can talk about some ways to integrate some people who are working on resilience or thinking about resilience in your community into that type of a climate action planning process.
Yeah, I think
Thank you, Brett. Sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Well, maybe just to add one additional comment to that. As you've got projects moving forward as well as part of the carbon commitment, resilience in some ways just helps ask another couple of questions of those projects. So, for example, if you're looking to add geothermal capacity, for example, to reduce your emissions, at the same time you can start to think about district energy solutions that are more resilient in the face of interruption to the power supply. Or you might think about, if you're adding additional sort of backup power but you face flood risk, let's not put those in the basement. Those kinds of questions. So it doesn't necessarily have to detract from the progress that you're already making, but rather helps further improve some of those projects. That would be a good place to start to think about integrating resilience.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask one last quick thing before we wrap up. Somebody asked if these resources are just for signatories or if they are available to anybody. So could you speak to that really quickly?
Sure, they are available to everybody. So the new website, it has all of these open to anyone who comes to the website. We certainly may consider at some point making sure that our signatories get the most benefit from being part of the network and putting some, particularly the more detailed resources, perhaps behind some firewall. We're considering that at the moment. There isn't a particular path forward for that. Certainly really open to hearing your thoughts about that. Obviously, we want to be as inclusive and as helpful as possible, but we also want to recognize that the signatories are really investing in this network and this process, and we want to be able to provide as much benefit as possible to those signatories. So let us know what you think about that. At the moment, it's all completely open, and we're looking forward to building on these throughout the next few months and the year in collaboration with you. You know, want to hear what you want to find on the website, what you would find most useful, and pulling in some of the innovative work that's happening across the network. These guidance are really designed to be a living resource. They're no longer just a PDF that we would have to, you know, update and republish, but we're hoping to add to this throughout the period of this network.
Thank you. And I just want to remind everybody, if you had questions, as some of you did, about reporting or about the more overall changes that Second Nature has been announcing in the past month, there is a webinar that's coming up on reporting specifically, so that would be a great one to tune into. And last week, our president broadcast another webinar that was an overview of, you know, the organization and the changes and the thoughts behind those. So the recording for that is available on our website. So be sure to check that out, and the follow-up message to this email will include the recording of this webinar, the slides, but it'll also include the registration link for the reporting webinar that's going to be coming up. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. If you have any questions, more information, you can email innovation@secondnature.org or commitments@secondnature.org. So have a great afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining.